So hello, welcome to India Today Global on Budget Day. We know that you're extremely busy figuring out what is happening on the Union Budget 2025, what it means for your personal expenditure, the tax you're going to have to pay, of course, that big announcement coming in from the Finance Ministry about having about changes in the tax slabs, about no income tax having to be paid up till the income level of 12 lakhs. So big announcements. I'm sure you're all going through that at this point in time. But of course, we at India Today Global like to look at India's diplomacy and its foreign policy. And part of that is unpacking India's diplomatic budget, its Ministry of External Affairs, and what India is giving its its diplomats to work with this year. And right off the bat, it seems that India's foreign ministry budget has been cut by around 10%. So it was around 22,000 crores last year. It's about 20,000 crores this year. And now we're going to unpack what exactly that means, where exactly the cuts have been made, what exactly that means for India's diplomacy, and why this is so important. So on a day when everyone else is talking about tax rates and so on and so forth, we're going to be talking about diplomatic budgets and getting into the weeds of how much aid India is giving to which country. So let's get into it. We won't take too much of your time, but if you're interested like us in India's foreign policy and its aspirations of being a great power, then things like this actually do matter. So now let's just start with the basics. This year, the budgeted amount for the Indian Foreign Ministry, the Ministry of External Affairs, is around 20,516 crores. Now that's down from 22,154 crores last year in 2024. So it's been around a 10% cut. But there is an interesting story within that cut that we're going to have to talk about. What does India spend its money on? Before we get into why it matters, what India is spending its money on is really the first priority, and then we can get into what these numbers, 20,000 crores, 22,000 crores, what do they mean exactly? So just to begin with, the Ministry of External Affairs spends a large part of its funding, about a third of its funding, on maintaining embassies and maintaining its passport services and its various secretariats and so on and so forth. Right? You have around 200 diplomatic missions around the world. You need to maintain them fairly reasonably well. And so this year, the Ministry of External Affairs will be spending around 7,500 crores, which is around a third of its entire budget, on handling its embassies abroad, its various diplomatic missions, its passport services, etc., etc. That's one part, 1/3 of the budget. Another third of the budget is India's spend on welfare and on providing foreign aid to countries all over the world. So in last year, India budgeted around 6,000 crores for foreign aid to countries in India's neighborhood, in Africa, Latin America, really all over the world. This year, that number has risen by over 1,000 crores to around 6,750 crores. That's important as well. It's a very big number. Amounting to, I would believe, about $100 million more that India is going to be spending on giving aid to foreign countries. Now, let's discuss what exactly has happened here. Top of the line, or everyone's probably thinking about Bangladesh. Aid to Bangladesh, actually, and assistance to Bangladesh has remained flat. It was 120 crores last year. It has remained 120 crores this year. Generally, projects get completed, they take time to finish, or they take less time to finish, and therefore those numbers fluctuate. They shouldn't be seen as a sign of India's particular diplomatic policy towards a particular country at all times. We shouldn't read too much into them, but what we're seeing here, of course, is that Afghanistan has seen the aid budget be halved. So for example, last year it was 200 crores, this year it's just 100 crores, so a halving of the aid budget to Afghanistan. Of course, what dominates, as always dominates, is Bhutan. India gave 2,000 crores, more than 2,000 crores to Bhutan this year in its diplomatic budget. Of course, that's basically 10% of India's diplomatic budget goes to Bhutan. That's an interesting amount because, of course, Bhutan is pretty much the closest thing India has to a military and security ally in the traditional sense of the term. India helps maintain Bhutan's armed forces, very close developmental relationship with the country, and has had that relationship for the last 70-75 years. So that is that's Bhutan, that's Afghanistan. Bangladesh, as I said, aid remains more or less the same. For a lot of countries, aid really remains more or less the same. With Sri Lanka, there's a 50 crore hike. 50% increase for the Maldives from 400 crores to 600 crores, a sign of the normalization, I think, in some senses of that relationship. Myanmar will get 100 crores more in this year's budget. African countries will be getting 25 crores more, and so on and so forth. Now, what you're seeing in general as well is that something that we've pointed out in the past is how little money India gives to Latin America, how much little it gives to Africa. We'll get into that. But really, the key point right now to keep in mind is that India has increased the amount of money that it gives for international aid and cooperation by around 1,000 crores. So a big step, a reasonably big step up. In terms of, a 20% increase in terms of the around a 20% increase in terms of the foreign aid it gives to the rest of the world. So that's important as well. Another, of course, increase, but where the decrease is coming from really is in the question of budgeting money for doubtful loans that the Ministry of External Affairs had given to a number of economically weaker countries. Now, this was part of the reason behind the big bump in the Ministry of External Affairs' allocation. It was around 22,000 crores at one point in time, and that was last year's allocation was 22,000 crores, and a lot of that allocation had to do with a certain amount of money that the Ministry of External Affairs had to budget for money that it had given in terms of loans to African countries that were now finding it difficult to pay that money back, and so the MEA had to budget a certain amount of money for those loans. Now that amount has disappeared this year, so that had added around 4,000 crores to the diplomatic budget in 2020 last year in 2024. So it went from around, in real terms, it was around 18,000, 90,000 crores. It went to around 22,000 crores, and now that amount has disappeared. So the big cut, when we talk about the cut, we're saying that it's been around a 1,000 crore increase roughly in how much the MEA spends on its embassies and so on and so forth. Remember that the Ministry of External Affairs has opened several new embassies in the last couple of years in Central America, in Eastern Europe, as well as in the Baltic states and in Africa. Lots of embassies being built in Africa. So more money is being spent there. More money is also being spent in terms of foreign aid. So those are good things. And the money that's been cut out is money that has been cut from the diplomatic from the diplomatic budgeting that we had to do for money that we gave to African countries. So we should not, of course, overread into this. There is, when we say there's been a 10% cut in the ministry's budget, that means that yes, there has been a cut, but also that cut comes from money that the Ministry of External Affairs had to budget for loans it gave to African countries. When you take that away, actually, there have been substantial increases in terms of foreign aid that has been given to foreign countries, as well as money that India is spending more on building embassies and enhancing its diplomatic network. So that's interesting, and that is commendable. But we have to get into some of the concerns and problems that that numerous persons have raised about the MEA's diplomatic budget over the last several years. And the point is essentially that India spends too little on the Ministry of External Affairs. Parliament's Standing Committee on External Affairs just 2 years ago had recommended that the MEA spend around 1% of the budget, that the MEA be given around 1% of the entire foreign union budget to run its affairs, to expand India's diplomatic network, to give more money to foreign countries, expand its strategic capabilities and its geopolitical influence, expand the number of people in the foreign service. Unfortunately, nothing of that sort has happened this year. There have been commendable increases in terms of embassy expenditure and development expenditure, but not to the level that you would expect for a country that wants to aspire to great power status. What exactly do we talk about when we say that the Ministry of External Affairs is not funded enough? The problem is that the Ministry of External Affairs has a couple of key constraints. The first one, of course, is that it has very few diplomats. Just about 2 years ago, the estimate was it has somewhere north of 1,000 Indian Foreign Service officers, which puts it at the same size as countries like Portugal and New Zealand. Right? Those are countries with minuscule populations compared to India, but they have foreign ministries that are about the same size. India also then underspends on key capabilities like soft power. The Indian Council on Cultural Relations is one of India's soft power bodies. The Parliament Standing Committee on External Affairs has for years called for expanding the budget of these soft power organizations to expand India's cultural presence abroad, make sure that it gets more cultural recognition abroad in the way that the United Kingdom or China or other countries spend. Unfortunately, India has hiked the budget of the ICCR by just around 20 crores this year, which, if you really crunch the numbers, is basically inflation, right? So the money given for soft power promotion has not really increased. So we're underinvesting in key capabilities. Another problem that has been raised is that we just give too little money to places like Africa as well as to places like Latin America. If you look at the budget at this point in time, the Ministry of External Affairs has given 30 crores gave 30 crores to Latin America last year. It's given 60 crores this year. So that's a doubling, and that's fine. But it's a very, very small amount, right? For a continent with hundreds of millions of people, that's a very small amount. And when you talk about economic aid to Africa, that's a continent with 1.5 billion people. We give them 225 crores in aid, which is a drop in the bucket, really, when you consider the kind of competition that is going on right now. It's $30 million, right? It's not a lot. And what people have been asking for when they say that the Ministry of External Affairs needs to expand its budget, it's that you need to hire more diplomats, you need to take on more responsibilities, you need to invest more in things like soft power, and you need to invest more in strategic geographies like Latin America as well as Africa. That is not happening at this point in time. So while there have been commendable increases, the numbers are not as good as they need to be. Notwithstanding, again, I'm pointing out again that although the headline number shows a 10% cut, it is also important to note that the cut is mostly because of the budgeting, but the budgeting that happened that the Ministry of External Affairs had to put in there for writing off or at least providing some guarantees for doubtful loans that had been granted to African countries. So it was really a financial budgeting requirement and accounting requirement. Now that's gone, and you take that away, the ministry has spent more on its embassies as well as its the aid to foreign countries. So I don't want to come down too hard on the Ministry of External Affairs as well as the Finance Ministry for the allocation it's given. But while that is still the case, while that is correct, it is also true to say that the ministry has not fundamentally answered any of the key questions in terms of its capabilities and what it needs to do to continue to expand its global presence. And the problem when it comes to things like this is that when you talk to foreign diplomats, as I do, I've been on the beat for about a couple of years, you always hear this consistent refrain that, look, you have so few diplomats. It's so hard for us to push all the things that we want to with India, do all the things that we want to do, because oftentimes, for example, a country like Australia that has a very strong partnership with India in the Ministry of External Affairs perhaps has one or two counterparts that it works with. And there are things that it wants to do ranging from climate change to power to investments to defense and so on, and it all goes through one or two people, right? So, for example, if there is a major diplomatic visit that needs to take place, let's say the Australian Prime Minister is visiting India, the entire work of the ministry and of that division freezes up because it's preparing for that diplomatic visit for about a month or two, and that paralyzes the working of the ministry. So the Ministry of External Affairs really has the ability to focus on just a couple of key priorities at one point in time. It doesn't have the wide-ranging capabilities that countries like the United States or China might have. Now, again, to be fair to the Ministry of External Affairs, it does spend a lot more money than countries like Indonesia, countries like Nigeria, that are also very large, but are also developing. They're not as advanced in terms of their per capita income as China or America. India does spend more than those countries, but neither Nigeria nor Indonesia has any ambitions of being great powers on the global stage. They are mostly African and Southeast Asian powers. They're regional powers. If India has global aspirations and it wants to be a Vishwaguru, as it says, it needs to spend like it, and it needs to put money behind its diplomats to get out and achieve that kind of influence. It's not doing that at the present. In fact, I just put out a tweet thread about on my Twitter on this exact question, and in fact, a very renowned French ambassador, Gérard Araud, basically co-tweeted it and said, where I basically said that, India's Ministry of External Affairs is too small and too broke, and he basically co-tweeted and said that's what every diplomat who meets the Indian Foreign Ministry thinks, which is that how do you guys get anything done with the number of diplomats that you have? And there are real concerns from the Ministry of External Affairs side as well. I don't want to be unfair to them that promotion structures, our foreign ministry is structured a particular way, and therefore if you intend to have a structure where your people are promoted in a reasonably timely fashion, get good postings, remain motivated, are allowed a chance to become an ambassador of India to a foreign country, that's a strong motivation for them. If you have a lot of people, then there's a pyramid in any organization, especially in the Ministry of External Affairs, and so the number of good jobs remains static, but the number of people coming into the system, if it increases, it means that fewer people will get a chance at those good jobs, and there will be a larger increase of people who are actually milling about, don't really have that important responsibilities, don't get promoted at the speed that they want to, and that could lead to frustration and morale issues. Those are real concerns. But you could also take on more global responsibilities, and that would mean that there are more roles for people to take on. You could expand what you do, let's say, in soft power, and assign more diplomats to those kinds of activities, and those would be good jobs that expand India's foreign policy and make sure that people are feeling rewarded and doing good work that pushes India's foreign policy abroad. This is a complex challenge, but the sense from this year's budget is that the Ministry of External Affairs is not doing what the Parliament basically recommended when it said, Parliament Standing Committee on External Affairs recommended when it said the Ministry of External Affairs budget needs to be 1% of the budget, which would push it to more than double what it is right now, and would really turbocharge a lot of India's efforts to expand its influence in a lot of strategic geographies. Now, we'll have to continue to see how this story develops. I'm sure we'll hear something from the Ministry of External Affairs as well in due course about what it plans to do. So I'll close this live by just saying that, commendable increases in foreign aid to a lot of countries in India's neighborhood, commendable increases in spending on more embassies and expanding India's physical diplomatic network all over the world. That's a great idea. But in terms of the really core issues, too few diplomats, not enough spending in strategic geographies like Latin America as well as Africa, particularly in places where America and China are really putting their financial might on display by trying to woo countries and by trying to work with them closely by giving them financial aid. A lot of countries, as expert Constantino Xavier, who we had on the channel yesterday, you can catch his interview as well. He said very clearly that a lot of African countries want to work closely with India, but if you're going to give the entire African continent of 1.5 billion people just about $30 million in terms of aid, how much money is there really to work closely with these countries? And that lack of financial capital also means that countries like Africa, which 30-40 years ago did not have the kind of footprint that India did in those parts of the world, they have pulled ahead of India in terms of their strategic relevance in key places like Africa. So that key issue has not been tackled. An expansion of the Foreign Service, an expansion in capabilities like soft power, an expansion in the diplomatic spend in terms of foreign aid as well as economic aid that India gives to other countries. A lot of that has not happened and will have to change if India is serious about becoming a global power. Thank you so much for watching us here on India Today Global as we unpack the Ministry of External Affairs' budget. We will try to get some of our defense people in, like Shivarur, and talk about the defense budget, what is happening on that as well, talking about strategic acquisitions, capital expenditures, new platforms for the Ministry of Defense, what that means for India and its foreign policy abroad. We'll keep you updated on this story. Thanks so much for joining us.